My name's Mike Good, and a lot of you guys probably wonder who the hell I am, and you're all welcome to think that because as a model builder, at least a model car builder, the last model I finished was when I was in high school in the 70s. So, but however, that doesn't mean that I haven't been working. My actual job is as a sculptor. I sculpt figures for the toy industry, model soldiers and such. And I've always been into model cars since I was a kid. And the last couple of years, a few things have come to pass. The first one was that my boyhood hero, Ed Roth, died. And you guys can hand this around if you want. It's a sculpture I did of him, action figure size. At any rate, when he died, I started thinking about things, you know, and you know, what was it about this guy that really torqued me, you know, really just got me excited. And it occurred to me that, you know, from the 1960s when he was creating his wild stuff up until today, nobody's really bothered to emulate what he's done, what he did, or to even come close. And why is that? Why is that? You know, I started thinking that. And it got me interested in the idea of designing cars. You know, I thought, well, you know, why don't I do it, you know? So I can't build real cars, so I'm doing it with models. But, and that's my inspiration as on one aspect of it. The other aspect is the, looking back at old models from the 60s. Back then there was a lot of creativity, and the models that won contests were usually really wild and crazy. And you know, I go to model shows now and I see a lot of stock cars and hot rods that are slick, but it's all been done before, you know. It's nothing that's original or new or dynamic, you know, it's kind of the same thing. And I'm thinking, well, why not go back to that day, you know? So what happened several months back was that I saw something online where Mark Gustafson was saying that he was building this model called the Astro Dan. It's a car from the it's a car model from the early 60s that won a couple of national contests in '63. And I just thought, you know, I called up, I contacted Mark and I said, are you working on that thing? And he said, well, he said he was working on it. He wasn't. So, but it turns out that I said, how about if I build the body for you, and then you paint it and we'll finish up the model. So that's what we did. So it was a real adventure for me, and it brings back something that I think is really cool, and that's the putty bomb. You know, putty bombs are where it's at. You know, this model, if an intruder broke into your house and you know, you had this model handy, you could throw it at his head and it would do him damage, major damage, because it weighs 2 pounds. And that's what's cool about putty bombs. And the other thing that's cool about them is that they're sculptures. And that's really what I'm doing, is I'm making model sculptures. And these are some samples. I can go a couple different ways with this. I mean, we can talk about the models, or I can just do the slideshow for you guys and show you how I built the Astro Dan. What sounds good to you guys? Slideshow. Okay, we can do that. And I have some books of my sculpture and stuff up here that, you know, anyone is welcome to look at later or come talk to me about. So we'll start.
What, are you sick or something? Did you do this all by yourself?
Well, my mom helped me.
Okay, I was going to say.
Yeah.
My God.
Let me see.
If that isn't Ed Roth, I don't know who the hell it is. Woo.
Well, anyway, this is what I started with. I contacted Mark, and he said he had the parts. So he sent me a 40 Ford sedan body and some fenders from obviously a different kit, and a set of Revell parts pack wheels, which were on the original. And then he also sent me some high-res copies of the original magazine article where the model appeared in Car Model magazine in June of '64. And so that's where I started. And, oh, is this focus here? Okay, all right. Okay, and the first step, of course, was figuring out what I had to chop off and what I had to leave behind. This thing was pretty radically sectioned, so I've just marked off the lines here and started cutting away at the firewall and stuff to make room for all the modifications. This thing doesn't work very good. Okay, and here I'm sectioning the body, and the tool at the bottom there is my Dremel tool. I got this really great diamond cutter from a place called Lasco out in California. When I first got my Dremel, they had this little saw, a little disc saw, which was a really great tool, but it was extremely dangerous because if it caught on something, it would just rip across and cut off a finger or what have you. So this is a really great tool because it's, unlike carbide cutters, it's unbreakable. It's made out of steel. And makes quick work of cutting stuff. Excuse me?
Is it fine too?
There's no teeth on it at all. It's a disc that's covered with diamond dust. Yeah, it's a diamond cutter, what they call it. So anyway, I glued the bottom of the body on and sectioned off the top part. And here you can see the missing section, and I'm fitting the roof on to the now very low body. He cut over ½ an inch out of that body, and in 1/24 scale, that's pretty radical. And you can see what a low profile the thing has. This is a thing that I often do, and it's important. Whenever you're cutting plastic, if you cut off too much, it's not a real big deal. You know, it occurred to me after that I cut the thing that the measurement in the article was more than he actually cut out. So to make up the difference, I just added some strip plastic there to the top, and I'll end up doing the same on the bottom. But evergreen strip plastic is one of the best inventions of the last 20 years, in my opinion, because you can make simple modifications like this simple, you know, not like the old days. And what's going on here? I've just marked up the body for all the different modifications, and here you can see. Whoops! Well, that's the end of that. Okay. Here you can see I was having some trouble with this lining up, so the body is narrower, or the body is wider than the top is at this section because we cut out a whole bunch of it. So what I did was I just put some sheet plastic in here to kind of push the body in so that it matched the width of the roof. And you can see up here where I cut this, I actually cut this in a step so that I got the cowl in there. And the other great thing about doing it that way is that it makes the cut very strong. If you have this little Z, you know, instead of just being joined here, you have this whole area where it's joined together, and it's a lot sturdier than most chop jobs. And here I'm fitting the interior panel that goes in there. There's like a rear deck panel. And the model's here. You guys are welcome to come up and look at it when you want to. And you can see I've started cutting out that big window there on the top. And again, that was done with the disc saw. I built this rear panel at this point because it's a lot easier to figure out the shape of the inside of the body when it's all separated. And here I'm putting more wedges into the body. And this is just to make sure that that whole structure is very sturdy. Because what happens when you start piling putty on these things is that you handle them pretty brutally. You know, you gotta sand and push on it, and the stronger you make it, the better. So that's what I'm doing there. And you can see that I had to cut a lot of the rear trunk off there to get the I don't like this. Whoop. Oh, I see.
Wrap the cord around your neck.
Yeah. Yeah, I've and you can see I've marked off where the rear window was enlarged quite a bit on that model too. And here's the beginnings of a hood scoop, which I guess was to balance off that cutout area. And you can see I've cut out the rear window at this point. And basically what I do is I just frame up everything. This is done just like real custom cars are, where you frame up everything in plastic rather than using conduit and metal rod. And then I fill in the areas with putty instead of sheet metal. You know, so it's the same basic thing. So what I'm doing is just getting a basic form for that scoop on there. And here you can see I've added this strip to the bottom of the body here where I had to cut off the running boards. That just to make sure that height of that body is enough. Like I said, it was sectioned. It ended up being sectioned a little more than the original, unintentionally so. And I've added a firewall in there. Okay, now here's a trick. This car had these, let me see, I got a big picture of it here. It had these custom front and rear grills that were completely made out of putty on the original, I guess. And I've found that making these openings out of sheet plastic and putty is a lot of trouble because it's hard to get sandpaper in there to get everything smooth. So I decided the best way to go about making these parts is to vacuform them. And that way I can get a perfect shaped form that's all nice and smooth on the inside, and I don't have to do any elbow grease to get it that way. So basically what I did was I cut out these pieces of sheet plastic to the shape of the grill openings. You have to make one slightly larger than the other because what happens when you vacuform a part is that the part has to come out of it. And if the sides are parallel, it'll never come off unless you carve it off. So you need to have a little bit of a taper on it so it'll come out. But anyway, I just cut out these shapes, and then I glued pieces of the evergreen strip. These are quite thick to build up the height. And this way I can ensure that these two pieces are perfectly parallel. There's no skew going on there. They're perfectly symmetrical. And then anyway, so I cut these out, glued them together, and this one I've just filled in the sides with putty. And then you just go back with a sanding stick and smooth it out. And that's what I'm doing here. It's just smoothing the edges and getting all this stuff perfect. It's real easy to get an outside form perfect as opposed to an inside form. And if you're vacuforming, you only have to worry about the outside form, and it makes it a lot easier. And here I'm working on the scoop a little more. And I'm starting to use the putty here. And what I've done, this tool here is one of my sculpting tools that I use for doing figures. And these are them. I make my living with these toothpicks. And that's all they are, is toothpicks that have been shaped. In the case of this one, the ends, as you can see, are rounded off. And you put the putty in here, and you get a wet tool, and you go in there, and you kind of roll it around. And I have some pictures that'll show that better. But basically, I'm just going in here and making sure that the inside of this scoop has a nice shape before I worry about the outside. Because once you start sanding on it, it's really hard to get to it. Yeah?
What kind of putty are you using?
I'm using epoxy putty, and at the very end of this we have a picture, and I'll give you the exact information. But basically I use a product called Aves Epoxy Sculpt, it's called. And that's what I use for all my figures, and you know, we can talk about those later. But anyway, there's some pictures here that'll show better what I'm talking about. This thing is... Okay, and here's the actual vacuformed grills being made. This is my Mattel Vacuform over here that I bought in the 70s and have had ever since. And I actually still have an original pack of the Vacuform plastic, which I use. And basically, here's one of the forms on a platen. I used some more of the strip plastic to raise it above the platen. You need to have a little bit of height on there so that you get the full form in there. And then it's just stuck on there with double stick tape. And then once you get a casting, the hard part is getting the part out of it. Even with the taper on there, it's a little stubborn. So what I did, let me see if I can focus this better. Now it's hard to see. What I did was I drilled some holes here, and then I used a probe to just push the part out of the piece. And then once you get it, you can just trim around it, and this is what you end up with. It's a nice hollow grill shell. If I wanted to make it completely all the way through, you just cut the back of it off, and you have a perfect form for any shape grill opening you want. And here I'm trying it on. Now this Vacuform plastic is pretty thin and kind of flimsy, so I reinforced it with sheet plastic just to make sure I got a sturdy thing going on there, because this will eventually be drilled to take some headlights, or head and tail lights, which on this model, the original model actually worked, and we're going to put LEDs in there. But there's got to be a sturdy enough piece to drill through and to mount those things too.
What kind of glue?
It's crazy glue. It's crazy glue. And you can see here that I've cut this all off flat and filed it flat in order to fit this grill on here and get it perfect. And the big problem when you're making forms like this is you really want to make sure you get things straight and symmetrical. So it takes, you need to take a little time to make sure everything's hunky-dory, because once you start putting the putty on, it's harder to fix. And in fact, a grill shell like this, the only way you can get rid of it once you got putty on it is just to grind the damn thing off. So don't want to do that. And here I'm fitting on the front grill shell. And basically all I did was I just cut the front of the fenders off, got a little angle shape in there that I could fit the grill shell into. And you can see I've also mounted the firewall in here and started filling in this area just to get the basic form. And here it is all put together, and it looks like a piece of crap, But at this stage, they all look like a piece of crap. And if you saw a Darrell Starbird car or Cushionberry or any of these guys, what they do is they They decide what shapes they want, they frame it up, and at the frame up stage, everything looks crappy because there's no form in between. Now here's another use for this strip styrene. This is a piece of square strip. It's like 30 by 30 or 40 by 40. And the engine compartment opening had this nice curved shape. Well, I could put putty on there and carve it out, but it's a lot easier to just take a piece of plastic, bend it to shape, and make sure that I get the rises in the different areas where I want that thing to set up. And it just creates a perfect form for adding the putty. And I've also began to add putty in places where there are little gaps. What you don't want to get when you start adding putty is places where there are gaps that go all the way through, because what happens is you push on the putty and it starts wanting to go through that hole. So I just go through with little bits and pieces just to block all the holes. And here I'm looking at the underside shot of the original model, and I can see that this was asymmetrical, so I'm trying to kind of imitate that shape that I see in the shot here. And basically I just frame up this back end with plastic, and this sheet plastic is actually glued to the bottom of the grill, so that's going to be the edge of the grill there. And yeah. And here I'm adding the putty, and this is the whole key to the thing. This tool I'm holding here is also another one of my sculpting tools. This one I use a lot for body work because I'm using bigger areas than I do on a figure. But the basic idea with the putty is it's a two-part putty. You blend it together, and it's kind of clay-like when you work with it. And the best way to get it on there and get it smooth is you just use a round tool like this in a rolling motion, just like you're rolling out bread dough with a rolling pin. And that's what I'm doing here. Now, the putty is a little sticky, so what you have to do is dip these tools into water. And because they're made out of wood, you have to soak these tools in crazy glue, sand them real smooth. It's important that they be perfectly smooth, because any little particle of crap on here is going to get transferred to the putty when you start rolling it out. But once I got the tools made, you just dip them in water and you roll it out, and the stuff just put it where you move it to where you want it to go with that rolling motion there. And here I've that was the initial application, and here I'm going back with the rolling again, and you can see it's wet here. But what I'm doing is I'm going over it repeatedly, and I'm just kind of pushing it down and getting it smoothed out to actually take that form there. What I'm filling here was where I removed the rain gutter on the edge of the roof. There were actually some little gaps in here, so I took a Dremel and gouged it all out and refilled it with putty to get it all perfect. But so that's you just keep going over it, and you can see I haven't really touched this area yet. But get it to this point by just rolling over it a couple times. And the last step is you just get a wet finger and you just smooth it over. And you can see here that at this point there isn't a hell of a lot of sanding that has to be done there. It's pretty close to the final form. Yeah?
This must be water-based putty.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. When it's soft, it is. Is this coming through? Pardon?
The water dissolves it a little bit, the putty.
Yeah, it does. But the stuff hardens in about 2 hours. So, yeah, the stuff hardens in about 2 hours. So the water solubility is only for about the first hour or so. But when you're working it soft, the water is really good. And like I say, you can smooth it to pretty close to the final form without too much trouble while it's soft. And here I'm doing the same, and I'm using this chopstick here, which is done pretty much the same way as the toothpicks. But I've just put a blob of putty on there, and I'm just smoothing it out just to get that nice round shape there on the roof. With water, of course, to keep the tool from sticking to the putty. What happens if you don't have that little water barrier in between is the putty will stick to the tool and it'll come up. So it's really important to do that. And here, as I was saying before, I'm just going in and filling all the gaps here. And this is just an initial application to make sure I don't have any little voids that are going to suck up that putty when I start piling it on. And you can see all the gaps that were in between this little frame piece have all been filled now. And here I'm adding it to the side. And these fenders were pretty crazy what he did to them. This kid in 1963 must have used 10 tubes of putty on this thing, and that was pretty typical for the time. But this stuff's a lot easier to use than that crap he was using, that's for sure. And this is a technique that I call edging. And what happens when you roll this stuff out, you're trying to roll it and press it flat. And what happens is you'll get excess, the excess putty will go off to the sides. And then to make a clean edge on it, you just take the tool and you just wipe it off. You know, you just wipe it off, and that's what I'm doing there. And when you do that, you've got, the form is you know, like 90% done at that point. Well, I can't say 90%, but you have to do a lot less sanding than, say, with a big hunk of Bondo or something. And here it is all roughed in, looking very rough. And what it's pointing to here is there was this little part of the fender that stuck out from the side. And basically what I did was I just took a piece of strip plastic on the bottom just to give me something to attach that putty to. Stuck it on there. And this has not been sanded in any way. This is just the surface as it looks after I've sculpted it on there. And here you can see at the bottom what I've done. And I've actually made an effort to kind of imitate the way the model looked in the photos in the magazine, including all the really rough, crappy looking putty underneath there. I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing, but this model is kind of an icon, and I wanted to make sure that we did it authentically. And here you can see, unlike everything else that's all framed out, he had these big horns that stuck out the front and back, and you can see it on the model here. But rather than make a frame for those, since the grill shell stopped about here, I just built it out by adding successive layers, and it took about 3 applications of putty before I got it all the way to where I wanted it. But again, you can see I'm using this tool to just, you know, I just got a blob of putty on there, and I'm just flattening it out and just kind of blending it into the form that's already there. Yeah?
Did you have to wait till the layers underneath dried? Because if you put water on it?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're applying the putty soft, you could make a shape like that, but it's just easier to make a large form by adding layers rather than do it all at once. I mean, I sculpted that Ed Roth head, you know, with that stuff, and you can get it to do anything you want if you really want to, but I just found that a free-form shape like that is easier to build in layers. So I added all that putty, let it harden, and then I added another layer, and there was probably another one on top of this one to get that final form. And if you can see on the model here, those horns stick out pretty radically, so it was a pretty big shape, and that's why I did it in layers like that.
Do you have to worry about shrinking on that putty?
This stuff shrinks 0. It doesn't shrink at all. And that's really one of the great beauties of it. most solvent-based putties will all shrink. And this stuff is pretty much inert when it dries. Whatever you put on there is going to stay there until you sand it or file it off.
You're saying your putty, because I've used epoxy putty and I think it's warped a door.
Epoxy putty won't warp a door. You must have applied heat to it, or the door was on its way to being warped already. Because that stuff generates a zero heat. It doesn't generate any heat at all. And I mean, I work with it all day long. I'm not sure why that would happen. Anyway, here's an old technique from the 60s. It's pretty clear that when he built this model, in order to get it low, this is where the stock 40 Ford wheel wells end. But to get these big tires under there, had to cut out the wheel wells. So I just flatten these areas and actually use the wheel to trace the outline of the wheel opening. And that's what I'm doing there. And you can see that this shape is now finished on here. Well, rough formed anyway, not sanded yet. And you can see it's pretty much taken shape at this point. And here I just used a disc sander and my Dremel tool to just to grind out that area up to the lines. And here I've marked off where these coved out areas. I just marked them out so that I can start working on those. And at this point, Mark came up with the turbine, the Revell turbine engine kit, which is a pretty rare item, I guess. So I took a picture of it because I'd never seen one before. But that's what was in there. And here, what I'm doing, these are where those coved areas are on the fenders. And what the knife is pointing to here is where I built up on the inside of the fender to allow me to grind out these big concave areas. And so, you know, once I got this putty in here, I took the tool and you know, and got it all even with the edge of the opening. And then I just went in with that same drum grinder and just ground out those coves, just hogged it out. And you can see here where the original fender, the original plastic fender is, you know, I cut right through that into the putty below it to get that shape. And this is a thing you can do with epoxy putty. If you know you want to remove a lot of material from an area, a lot of times with plastic, you know, you remove too much, you end up with a hole. So it's real easy to fill behind anything that you want to grind out and have at it from the top, and you won't worry about destroying the piece. And also you can see here I decided that this grill shell wasn't really sticking out enough, so I got some of that magic evergreen plastic and just glued it on there, putty over it, and you can't tell. Now this is one problem that I've encountered with the putty. The putty is a little bit softer than the plastic. So what happens when you have an area where plastic and putty merge is that you start sanding on it, and pretty soon, I'm sure you guys have all seen this happen, the plastic's sitting a little higher than the putty. So in order to avoid that problem, I just took a ball grinder, and anywhere where that plastic's exposed, I just gouge it out, completely gouge it out from the surface. And then once you fill it in, once you fill it back in, you're dealing with nothing but putty, and you can get that stuff perfect real easy. So here I'm just kind of rolling some putty into those big gouges there. And one of the features of this car was that window that goes up into the roof there. And we couldn't really figure out how he did it. After looking at the pictures, I decided he used a piece of celluloid that he bent into shape. Well, that's pretty crude. So I decided what we needed to do was to make a master to vacuform the windshield so it'll all be one nice piece that curves and fits the model perfectly. So what I have here is the stock kit windshield, and I just taped it in place, and I glued a piece of plastic here, and this plastic will hold the putty for me to finish that form. And here, and once this hardens, you take the tape off, you pop the piece off, and it fits perfectly because it's been formed against the original part. And you can make any part fit perfect this way. Add a little putty to it, grease up the part, put them together, and there will be no gaps because it's all filled with putty. Now here's the Zen part. Sanding there's a real art to it, and I'm still learning. But the one thing I've learned is that when you're trying to get the original form, you need to use really coarse paper. This is like 80 or 100 grit sandpaper that I'm using here. And it's pretty nasty stuff. But this car is very organic. It's very curvy. And when you're trying to make a convex curve like that, or concave curve like that, well, it's actually a compound. The best thing to do is to take that piece of sandpaper, and you can see I have it folded over here, so it's like a double layer. And you curve it, and you hold it in your hand, but don't smash it. The idea is that this part here is flexible. And when I start sanding on that, it'll conform to the curve of the body. And that's how I got a nice flowing curve here. And this had to be done all over this body because of the way it's designed. But the hard work, I think, is sanding. And here I'm truing up the wheel wells once I got this. And you can see how nice this came out once I gouged out that area and filled it back with putty. It's all putty. It all sanded real nice and even. Don't have to mess with it. But again, this is an old technique from the 60s. I just taped together a bunch of wheels, put a hunk of sandpaper on there, and just sanded it out, and it gives you a nice perfect round curve. Okay, this car had opening doors, and once I got all the body work in place, it was time to cut out the doors. And I haven't done much of that, but I decided the easiest way to do that was to make a template of the exact door shape, since it's got rounded corners here. And basically I just taped it to the side of the model, took a scriber and scribed around it, and I basically cut out the doors with the scriber except for the last little bit. Once I could see light through that little gap, then I just took an X-Acto knife and cut it the rest of the way. But it's pretty tedious, but in the end it gives you a nice door without too much material removed. And the beauty of using the template was once I've done this side, I used the same template and just taped it to the other side of the car, so the doors are perfectly symmetrical because they use the same template. And here I was having fun with paper clips. The original car appeared to have hinges made from paper clips. That was before they had, I think it was before they had the Auto World hinges. So basically I just took advantage of these little curves in the paper clip to make these arcs. And you can see I had to bend up several of them before I got a couple that worked. And then I glued them in place with this JB weld. I don't know if you guys have used this epoxy, but it's the best stuff in the world. And it's exactly the same kind of epoxy I used to use when I was a kid. And this stuff will never come off. So it's pretty messy, but once it's on there for good. And you can see I just used 1/16 aluminum tubing for the actual hinges here. And you just fit them on to the paper clips. And this is real hard to see. I'm sorry, it's not lit very well. But what I'm doing here is I've got this door taped in place, And in order to fit the actual tubing on here that holds the hinge, I just taped it in place. And there's also tape on the outside to make sure that door is right exactly where it's supposed to be. And then I just got that little piece of tubing, stuck it in there, and then I just took some more of that epoxy and kind of dabbed it in there. You just need to avoid getting it on the hinge itself, and you have perfect hinges. And you can see where this opposite door here is taped in place from the outside. And here's the body. Pretty much got it all sanded out at this point. There's a lot of sanding going on there, believe me. But one thing you can notice is I have there's this lip that goes on the front of the grill here, and it's pretty heavy duty. So in order to make sure that is all even in the end, it's really hard to control the width if you're sanding on the top here, you know. So what I wanted to do was I just sanded it flat in the front here to make sure that I got an even width all the way around. And then once I got that, you can go back and round those edges, and the edges all look perfectly uniform at that point. And here's some chassis stuff, the old Revell custom car parts. And one of the things was the kid obviously had removed the muffler detail from the original kit, so I just decided to cut the stuff out and replace it with sheet plastic. And these front axles, this model was built in the days that all models had metal axles. There wasn't any such thing as a nice plastic axle that had mounting hubs for the wheels. So I just drilled holes into the frame just to make sure that the thing all sets right when it gets on its wheels. And here I'm fitting the wheels on. You can see I just added these little tabs to the chassis, drilled through those to mount the axle. And the actual axle parts that go on the chassis are just cosmetic. They don't have anything to do with holding the wheels on at all. And you can also see here that I have the turbine engine together, and I've stuck a bunch of wires on there that don't really do anything but make it look busy inside there. And this is the condition it was in when I sent it to Mark. I don't know if you can focus this thing. And that's a picture of the original model. And you can see now that I've rounded off this lip and how it looks nice and smooth now. There's a top view. Looks a little like some bizarre abstract sculpture from that view. And like any good Hollywood movie star, this model has a good side and a bad side. This isn't the good side. Pretty bad. That's a bad exposure. Here's the finished piece. You can see here where I added these new floorboards in with sheet plastic just to get a smooth area there. And there's the putty, Aves Epoxy Putty. If anyone wants to write this down, it's avesstudios.com. And you can order the putty directly from them. That's where I get it. And yeah, any questions or things? So that's.
They make. I've seen their advertisements in fine scale, and they make different levels. Do you know what the difference is between the different types of?
I don't, but the stuff I use is this. It's called Epoxy Sculpt. They have epoxy mold. They have a couple of different names for them. But this one's called Epoxy Sculpt. And very important, get the white putty, because the normal putty is this kind of gray stuff, and it's very translucent. And the problem with that stuff is when you start working with it, you don't really see the surface because the light penetrates it. So the white stuff's opaque, and it's a lot easier to see what you're doing when you're working with it. Any questions or?
Is there any special primer or any paint problems with this putty?
It's epoxy, and it's very inert. You can spray lacquer right over it, and it won't affect it at all. You have to prime it because the model is half plastic, and the primer's for the plastic, not the putty. You could spray directly on the putty if you wanted.
And just to ask you again to make sure I understand, and you put this stuff on after you mix it up, water will dissolve it a little bit so you can smooth out around edges?
It dissolves it only slightly. Mostly what it does is it prevents it from sticking to anything. But the water, when I'm smoothing it out, I get the finger all wet. It's like a lubricant, It just lets your finger flow over it nice, and you can get it pretty smooth that way.
It's not really dissolving it then. You don't end up with a lot
It
of time.
dissolves a little bit of it. When you look at your finger afterwards, there'll be a little residue on there, but it's negligible. And anyway,
What's the setup timeline?
it takes about 2 to 3 hours for it to harden completely, and working time, it starts to stiffen up after about an hour or so. So you have a little while to play with it. But once it starts going off, you should just let it harden, and then you can always mix more later if you haven't gone far enough with it. And I have some more slides here. I don't know. We can either discuss some techniques here, or I can show you the beginnings of my original design Batmobile here. And I brought this along because it shows the model in process. You can see where I've got this side all framed up and ready to go. And here I've added the first application of putty just to get the basic shape and form on there. If you want, I can show you more slides of how this was done. Is that okay? Okay. The basic car here. Okay. Well, first I want to talk about the Batmobile. There's a couple reasons why I did this. There's a magazine called Modeler's Resource that has a contest going right now where you build a Batmobile. You can either build one from the comic books, or you can design your own. And I was online recently, and I saw the Batmobile for the new movie. They had this big dramatic unveiling, and there's smoke and everything. And when the smoke clears, there's this pile of junk on the stage with tractor tires. And that's the new Batmobile. And I said, wait a minute. I should think that Batman would want to drive a car that he wouldn't be embarrassed to be seen in. And to me, that doesn't say Batmobile. So I kind of went back to the idea. Barris got really lucky with the Lincoln Futura when he did his Batmobile, because it was already a pretty cool car, and he didn't have to do much to it. So my idea is that Batman would rather have a cool car, something more James Bond than junk pile, So I decided, I went through Tamiya's catalog. I really love working with these Tamiya kits because they come with really nicely detailed suspensions and really cool engines and stuff. And a lot of the parts, the suspension parts and the engine parts, are pretty modular, so you can use them for different vehicles and stuff. But I just went through their catalog, and I found the car that had the best line that I thought would work for what I had envisioned in my mind. And that turned out to be this Mercedes CLK GTR Racer. And I decided it needed a bubble top. I originally thought I would put a double bubble on there like the Barris Batmobile. But I started digging through my kits, and I found this Corvette Indy, and it's got a great bubble top in it. So I decided that's the one I want to put on there. So basically all I did was I cut the whole mounting area of the bubble top from the Corvette Indy kit, and I aligned it really carefully to make sure it was all even on there, taped it in place, and then I just went in here with a marker to mark off exactly where I needed to cut the body to fit that in place. And here I am gluing it in place. And you can see I just followed this line really precisely here, taped it in place. Now there's a reason why the window's in there, and this is really important when you do this stuff. That window fit on the original body perfectly. Now if I'd just taken that frame and glued it onto the car, it might distort a little, and that would create a problem with fitting the window. The window would no longer fit perfectly. So what you want to do is you want to tape the window in place when you put this frame on. And that way you know it's going to fit, because if it fits now and you glue it in place, it'll fit later. But if you left the window off, you run the risk of it distorting and creating all kinds of problems later on. And here, here's this, the opening for the rear deck goes along here and over here. And I was thinking originally that I was going to have the deck come off, but I'm kind of going more for a curbside at this point. But basically what I did was I aligned the back of the window with the opening of the hood, and that way I figured that the two parts would mate perfectly. And I'm just going in here with a photo etched saw to make that cut. And the reason I use the photo etched saw is it's very thin and it won't take hardly any material out of there, so it's ideal for doing that kind of work. And here I'm fitting the rear deck part in place. And again, I just used the part to make this outline. Got my trusty old disc cutter. In 2 minutes I was gluing the part in. And again, the window's taped in place to make sure that everything's hunky-dory when I get it glued on. And here I'm just gluing it on. You notice I don't use any special zap or anything. I go to the grocery store and get crazy glue. I hate those $4 and $5 bottles of cyanacrylate glue, because what happens is the bottle usually clogs before you get halfway through it. And I figure I'd rather spend $2 on crazy glue and use the whole damn tube, So anyway, what I do is I just have a little piece of cardboard, that's coated like a model kit box. And I just put a little puddle of the glue on there, and then I just use one of those trusty pieces of strip plastic, dip it in there, and I have a perfect glue applicator, and I can control exactly how much I put in there, and makes it a lot easier. Now, I decided the Batmobile had to have fins. The problem is every Batmobile I've ever seen had fins tacked onto the top, and it looks ridiculous because it doesn't really jibe with the lines of the car. And a fellow by the name of Eldon Titus, he built a car called the Voodoo Spider, which he did from a model that he built way back in the 60s. Well, he's got a new car that he's working on now. It's called the Vampire, and it's got these really swoopy fins, And I was looking at that, and they're kind of similar to a 59 Chevy fins, so I said, okay, I'll just cut the back off a 59 Chevy and graft it on, and so that's what I'm doing here. Now, this is an important thing. God, I wish I could focus this thing. Is there any way to... I think this is supposed to work, but it doesn't seem to work. No, it's not doing anything. It's just getting worse. Is this it? Oh, there we go. Okay. One thing that happens when you start chopping up kits like this is that if you're not careful, it's really easy for them to get askew, and pretty soon you got a body that's turning right or turning left, and you try to fit it to the chassis, it's like, no go, dude, no go, So what I do, and this is very important, is the whole time I'm working on this model, I'm making sure that every part I fit on here is perfectly aligned. And the way you do that, in this case I have the chassis, you can see, is taped in place. Now this front section here came from a Ferrari Enzo, and I knew I wanted that pointy nose on there. So what I did was I measured the cuts that I made on this car and transferred them to the Enzo nose. And then once I got the Enzo nose in place, I used this chassis and carefully measured each side to make sure that that sucker was perfectly straight and centered on there. And at this point, if we go back here, at this point, all that's left of this Porsche or this Mercedes body is just these two side pieces. In other words, the body's gone now. But because every step along the way, I made sure that this body was aligned and that everything was solidly glued, the structural integrity and the dimensional integrity have been maintained. And it's because I was really careful to make sure everything was solid before I went to the next step. And so here I'm lining up the front end. And obviously there's big gaps between the Ferrari Enzo fenders are a lot lower than the Mercedes fenders. So in order to solidify this thing and to make sure that it's all sturdy, I glued pieces of strip plastic in between to really firm up that body and make sure everything's just solid, you know. And at this point, it's as solid as any body in any kit, you know, apart from the fact that it's glued together. And the crazy glue, once it's dried a couple of days, it is solid as hell. And here I was trying to figure out how to do the nose. Now the front grille, I knew I wanted to have this kind of wedge-shaped thing going there. The whole idea is to make it all angular. And the Batmobile, to me, has to be kind of zoomorphic. It has to have a face on the front like the original one, you know. So I wanted it to be this kind of mean, aggressive-looking thing. So in order to make this grille, I used the original Enzo piece, and I made a little jig that's got the center line drawn on it. And this, so I can make my new grille, I have a perfect jig to align the parts to make sure that they're all kosher. Well, there's another thing here too. This part here was cut out of a Porsche GT. I knew I also wanted these radiator exits on the front. A mid-engine car like this, there's two options for mounting the radiators. You can put them on the sides, or you can put them in the front of the car. And since I already had a grill going on there, I thought these nostrils will look kind of cool on there anyway. So I just found a kit that had good-looking louvers and something I can fit in place there. Now here, I'm lengthening the nose of this Enzo part. And what I did was, you can see the center line here. I brought that center line forward to make sure that that nose is right on the center line of the original part. So now I've got the Porsche part with the Enzo part perfectly aligned, and now I'm going to manufacture a whole new part that's perfectly aligned because it was aligned to the original piece. And at this point, I decided I was going to put some Dodge Viper headlights on it. They had the nice eye look that I was going for. I eventually trashed that because in the end, they ended up being too big and bulky looking. They just totally overpowered the front of the car. And this happens sometimes. A lot of times when I'm designing models, for instance, this Volkswagen here, I didn't really know how the front end was going to look, so I actually framed out the front end with sheet plastic and put clay over it, just to look at the shapes and make sure it's okay before I start puttying. I mean, a lot of times when you get into a model and you've got a lot of putty on there and you put a lot of hours into it, it's like, it's pretty heartbreaking to suddenly realize this thing looks like crap, you know. So it's a lot easier to do it with the clay, you know. With the clay, you can put it on. If it looks like crap, big deal. You pull it off and you try something else, you know. But with the putty, it's a lot of labor and you're kind of locked into it. So it's better to be safe than sorry. And in this case, this particular model, I had a vision in my mind what I wanted to do, And, you know, I thought the Viper headlights were going to work, but once I got them in place, I realized it was a mistake. So here I am. You can see I've got this nose piece perfectly formed here now. I've gone over with another layer of putty and sanded it all out. And I wanted to get this sanded out pretty close to the final shape because it's really hard to get in here with a piece of sandpaper and finish it off once you got it in place. So that nose piece is pretty much shaped at this point. And then I just took the center line, lined it here, and then I just decided what kind of a shape I wanted that lip to take. And here you can see I'm just marking it up to cut it out of sheet plastic. And here it is in place. And you can see that it aligns with that Ferrari Enzo piece perfectly. And so now this lip is perfectly aligned with the whole rest of the body because I systematically made sure that everything was kosher before I put it together. And at this point, I was just gluing that lower grill lip to the nose.
Your Viper headlights sure look like crap.
They did. No question. So anyway, these are the outer forms for this grill shell, and these were just cut out of sheet plastic. One thing I do, you know, these look like straight lines on here, but actually none of these lines are really straight. They have a slight curve. And the reason for this is that if you put straight lines on something, it looks really angular, and your eye kind of wants to stop on it. Even though this is a real subtle curve, it carries your eye. And it's a real important thing to remember when you're doing stuff like this. Straight lines are going to stop your eye, whereas even a slight curve will make your eye move along that line better. Oh. Yeah, and you can see here, these were just sections of that Viper hood I glued on there. And in order to solidify this, I was putting sheet plastic in here and glue it in place to solidify everything. Again, I'm just making sure everything's solid before I'm ready to put putty on it. And here you can see, it's really hard to tell what the thing's going to look like when you're done. I had the vision in my mind, and I'm thinking, yeah, those Viper lights are going to work, But here I've got everything all framed up, and it's all solid. And you can notice here on the grill shell, on the back of the grill, this is 40,000 sheet plastic, so that's all you have on the back. Well, I know I wanted to glue a grill behind there, a piece of mesh. And you need to have something to glue it to. So in order to do that, I beefed up all these sides and made sure everything was all even and straight on the back so that I actually have a nice flat mounting area for that mesh when I get it in. There's nothing worse than trying to fit a piece of mesh to a kind of lumpy, bumpy shape. It'll never go, and it'll look like crap when you're done. When I get that grill in there, that grill's going to be perfectly flat, and it's going to look like it belongs. Okay. When you're doing custom cars, when you're doing any kind of cars, and I think a lot of guys probably don't pay enough attention to this, wheels are the most important piece you put on a car. I mean, you can prove this to yourself at home. Go grab any kit off the shelf and try, a pair of wheels with hubcaps on it. Then try a pair of mags. You try a bunch of different wheels, and you'll find that you can try 20 sets of wheels, but there's only one set that looks really good on that particular car. So it really is important to take time to pick the right wheels. Now, I bought these. These are Hoppin' Hydro's Venetian wheels, they're called. Is this guy here. I'm not sure why I bought them. They're kind of ugly, really. But the thing is they were perfect for this car. This car needed some kind of loud, angular-looking wheels to go with the bat theme, and these were perfect for it. But the problem is they look really terrible without an offset rim. I mean, this flat wheel is just it just dies. And I've tried it on a dozen different cars, and it doesn't look good on any of them. You know, so what I did was I picked up a set of Aoshima wheels, and there's a whole series of wheels that they do, 20-inch wheels that come with these separate offset rims. And they're chrome, they're smooth, they're very nice. What I've done is I've repeated these wedge, the grille, the headlights, the side panel, and you notice the side panel blends perfectly into the fins here. It's all wedge shapes, and when you get the final result, it looks pretty racy. And but this was the idea I had in mind at first, but it's an artistic thing, and it's very important to get these kind of relationships between your shapes, because that's what carries the design and makes it look cohesive. But anyway, any questions or? No? Yeah.
For your Beetle over there, what did you end up doing for the front and rear and the side fenders to spread them out? Did you use kits, or did you just carve,
Okay.
sculpt those?
You can see here the stock body, and the problem I had was the chassis on that is another one of those Tamiya kits. It's a Ferrari Mythos chassis. I knew I wanted it to be mid-engine, and I knew I wanted it to have a big, cool engine, so it's got this boxer 12-cylinder engine happening, you know. The problem is that a Ferrari Mythos is about this wide. So what I ended up doing was I sawed the fenders off, and you need to make sure that these cuts are perfectly vertical, because if they're off a bit, it'll get askewed, and that's why the back end's crooked. I learned this the hard way, believe me. But anyway, I just cut these fenders off, and then I used some more of that evergreen strip plastic of the correct widths to push out the fenders to the, you know, the rear fenders were widened a lot more than the front, but the front were widened too. So I just glued those strips in there, and I flared out the wheel wells quite a bit. There was a lot of work done on those fenders, but basically I started with the Volkswagen part, and I just modified it to get the shape I wanted and to make sure these big 20-inch wheels fit underneath those fenders. And it took a little doing, but it's just the plastic strip and putty. That's all it is. And same with the front end here and the back end. I just used a sheet of plastic to get this form, and the hood came off of a Revell Shelby, the modern Shelby, I don't know what they call it, just for the exit for the radiator. Glued it all together and puttied it all up and blended it all in. Any other?
As far as the epoxy putty, does it have any kind of a shelf life, and what is the cost range for that stuff?
Yeah, it does have a shelf life, and because I use it professionally, I buy these large tubs. It comes in a smaller size. Unless you're going to use a lot of it, I recommend the smaller size because it does have a shelf life. It depends on the putty and the conditions, you know, but you know, I've had putty that's lasted 2, 3, 5 years, and then I've had other ones that lasted maybe a year. If you go into a hobby shop and they've had Milliput on the shelf for 5 years and you buy it, it's probably not going to last you more than a month because the stuff's already started to deteriorate before you've opened the package. You know, so it does have a limited shelf life. But if you want to try it out, I recommend buying one of the smaller sized packages, and that way you can play around with it and you don't have to worry about it going bad on you. You know, after you spent the 5-pound tubs that it's 2 tubs that I get run about $25, and for a small one you can probably get a small package. Like, I don't know what the size is exactly, for like 11 or 12, I would think. No.
You said,
Here,
you
get there.
mentioned. Are we on?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Milliput. Does this epoxy act about the same as it as far as molding it?
Milliput, yeah, Milliput is just a different form of epoxy putty. Now, as I said, I've been sculpting with this stuff for well over 20 years now, and I've gone through a lot of different epoxy putties. I used Milliput at one time. I don't like Milliput that much. I don't use it at all anymore, mainly because it's kind of stiff when it's soft. It's really hard to work. This stuff, this Aves is a lot softer, and it's a lot easier to work, and it's also a lot easier to blend out, you know, when you get your finger over there and you're smoothing, you know, trying to feather those edges. It's a lot more forgiving because it's softer. Yeah, yeah.
Going toward door lines, do you have trouble, let's say you feather the putty into plastic, and then after everything's dry and sanded, you start to scribe door lines. Do you get any chips where the two places meet?
Yeah, yeah. And the best thing to do is to avoid having putty on the areas where you want those panel lines. In the case of the Astro Dan, the first time I put the template on, I got it misaligned. So I actually had to go back and fill in these areas. But I tried to avoid having putty actually in the area where I'm going to scribe. You can do it, but you probably have to go back and touch it up to get rid of those nicks, because they will appear.
And you were in the seminar with Mark when I asked about the scribing, the using like a scribing tool or a dental tool. Is that pretty much the same thing you do?
Yeah, I have a scriber. I don't remember where I got it even. It's just a stainless steel bar with a point on the end. It's nothing really special. And actually, you could see me using it in that one picture. It's just not a special one like he was using. I think he said he had a bare metal one or something like that. It's just one I got wherever I found it. Any other questions?